All right, we will be in John chapter 13 today, hopefully covering the whole thing. But it's not really where I want to start. You know me, I like to lead up to things, right? It's like watching Bob Ross. I'm really glad they put Bob Ross on Netflix. You know, watching that guy is like an experience. It's not like you can zone out to it or something. I mean, it's just, you're hooked. He has you hooked when you watch him. I'm sorry. I'm hooked.
That's sort of our Woodstock, yeah.
It really is.
Bob Ross is our Woodstock.
It really is.
Experience.
Yeah.
Who's Bob Ross? I'm sorry.
I don't
Oh.
curly hair, white
Oh.
He has that wafro.
From like the 70s?
Late 80s, early 90s. Yeah.
Okay.
Happy little tree.
Yeah, happy
Yeah.
looking, yeah. He just has a way of drawing people in.
He looks like
Yeah.
So do you paint along with him?
No. And that's the biggest deception, that you can paint like Bob Ross. I mean, come on. He's like, and just make sure to send me your pictures when you're done. As if they'll be a tenth of the way you know, as good as what you're doing today. But he lived in Alaska for all those years. I think he lived in Alaska for about 12 years. So he got to see all the beauty, but the thing was, he was there because of the military. So he was there in the Army, and he said that he got yelled at constantly getting yelled at. So he made a conscientious choice before he left to never raise his voice. So that's why he was always very calm. So, but just the way that he speaks and paints is it's really cool. And I watched his son, Steve, I think was his name. Not as good. Not as good. So, but today I'd like to paint a picture, if you will, of John chapter 13, the very beginning of it. And we're going to start in talking about Jesus' hour. Now we've covered this at least 3 times because I have 3 references leading up to what we would consider, or what Jesus considered his time or his hour. Okay. So what that means, and I'll just read verse 1 here of 13. It says, "Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come." Now, if we've been paying attention, and I had to go back and reread these verses too, is that we've been just discussing about how his hour hasn't come. Now we're going to talk about that his hour has come, and that he should depart from this world to the Father, having loved his own, who were in the world. He loved them to the end. So if I could hand out 3 verses, I think these 3 lovely participants will work. Noah, can you grab, this is all in John, so 2:4, 7:30, 8:20. And I want you to listen to these references in John to kind of pinpoint where we're at in our account of Jesus. Let's go ahead and whenever you're ready.
Jesus saith unto her, Woman, what have I to do with thee? Mine hour is not yet come.
Therefore they sought to take him, but no one laid a hand on him, because his hour had not yet come.
These words Jesus spoke in the treasury as he taught in the temple, and no one laid hands on him, for his hour had not yet come.
Sounds like there was a time that his hour would come, right? It's right now. It was John chapter 13. His hour has come. And so, what does that mean? Hour for what? Hour for... What's the time? For his death? For his glorification? His resurrection? All the events leading unto for his ministry, all the time that he put into teaching, all the time that he put into preaching the kingdom's coming, and all these things, is now, there's that time. And so now we've arrived to it. So verse 1 of chapter 13 again says, "Now before the feast of the Passover." What's so special about this Passover? Well, we've talked in recent weeks about how Lazarus and him raising him from the dead, he didn't do that at Passover 1, Passover 2. He's now doing it at Passover 3. Jesus' ministry was 3 years. He's now doing it at the very end of his ministry, just before the Passover, just before his death. Remember, it's not much longer now. This is why it says his hour has come. He's now arrived to that hour that all these things are going to really start ramping up. And the earth in our time has an hour too, doesn't it? I mean, we're seeing a lot of crazy stuff going on in the world right now. A lot of crazy stuff. I was telling the kids, I said, whenever I get to work and I kind of settle in and make sure things are running okay, usually try to check the Bible verse of the day first, you know. But then I fire up Google News, and right there at the top, I shudder sometimes to click that link because of what I'm going to find. And recently, you know, there's been some pretty bad news, and it just keeps getting worse. And that's the thing, is that this earth has an hour to it as well. And we are approaching that hour if we're not already in that hour. And so Jesus says when he knew that his hour had come, who else would have known that but Jesus? He knew his timetable. He understood those things. And so he says, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. His love for them didn't stop. It didn't slow down. He loved them all the way up to the very end. The end of what? His life on earth. And then of course beyond that. And so, of course, what the Passover was, and we've studied this, is basically what happened was God told Moses when he appeared to him in Egypt and said, okay, we're going to reset your months now. I know the calendar that you've been observing is probably an Egyptian calendar or whatever, but we're going to reset your months, and today is going to be the first day of the year, basically. And on the 10th of this month, you're going to select a lamb from your herds. It can't have any spots, can't have any blemishes, and you're going to take that into your house. You're going to select it on the 10th. And what was going to happen 4 days later on the 14th? They were going to kill it. Isn't that the Passover that we're talking about? And so that day on the 14th the feast, the Passover feast lasted 7 days. So that it starts on the 14th, ends on the 21st. And during that entire week, they were not to do what? What was not supposed to be anywhere near them? Leaven. You cannot have leaven in your house. It has to be unleavened bread. Right? This is a feast of unleavened bread. It's a feast of in the Passover. And so there wasn't supposed to be any leaven at all in their house. And so,
Randy,
yes.
What's the significance of that?
Well, I think leaven represents sin. And so I think when Jesus was talking to the crowds, he said, "Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees." So don't let that little germ, germ that you bake and it becomes bigger. I don't know what that is, but it's like a leaven lump. If you leave it on your counter, it'll get bigger, right? Because there's a reaction going on and all that, and it gets bigger. So I think what he's saying is that beware of that deception, like Noah talked about, that can get in your heart, and then it just starts spiraling out of control, and it becomes bigger. So I think that's the significance. I don't know if anyone has anything to add to that, but so what they did is they said no leaven, and that's why when we take the Passover, there's not a big loaf of doughy bread. There's no leaven in it. It's like crackers. And so they were told to on the 14th day of that month to start the Passover feast, to kill the lamb and eat it hurriedly, shoes on, standing up at the dinner, at the table. So I believe that that's exactly what Jesus did with his disciples. And so he says, this is the Passover feast. And this was something the Jews did every year. This wasn't something that was new to them. And so he says he loved them to the very end. So we see here that up until this time, Jesus' hour had not yet come. It wasn't time for him to go through these things. But suddenly now it is. So Jesus has arrived at that hour. And so we can kind of see hints of this here. And I'll just go to chapter 12, verse 23. It says, "But Jesus answered them, saying, The hour has come that the Son of Man should be glorified." Who's going to be doing the glorifying? What is that all about? See, I think that's talking about when Jesus has died and now has been resurrected. Was he glorified up until then? No. He took on the form of a human. He wasn't glorified until he was resurrected. Didn't he tell, was it Mary or Martha, one of those two, that says, don't cling to me, don't hug me, because I haven't yet ascended to my Father. So he didn't want that. But what do we see in his glorified body? That he could go through walls, as it were. He could appear and disappear. He could, could do miraculous things. And so, that's because he was in a glorified body, the one that God gave him after he resurrected him. Verse 27, the same chapter, says, "Now my soul is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. But for this purpose I came to this hour." As we talked about last week, there's no backing out for Jesus. He might have struggled with the actual going through with it there in the garden, as all of us would. But how many of us would have bailed that night and said, "Lord, call down the angels. I can't do this." But Jesus, determining in his heart that night that he would go through it, he did it. And so he says here, "For this reason I came to this hour." And so our verse again in 13:1. Jesus, knowing that his hour had come. So what does that mean? That means that the remainder of our book today, starting today, is going to be that last, as it were, hour. And so Jesus' very last days on earth. So that's what we're going to focus on. And what I like about John, love about John, is that he includes this personal, these personal lessons, this personal teaching that none of the other Gospels include. There's plenty that the other Gospels include that John doesn't include. That's why you have to read them all to get the whole picture. But John includes chapters 14, 15, and 16. You can always lump those together. Because if you've noticed, if you take a quick gander, most of it's red. If you have the words of Christ in red. And that's because it's Jesus' last time that he can really teach his disciples in a very intimate way. And I think by then he was able to tell them more, and that they were maybe even able to appreciate it more, because they had been with him for 3 years. And so I think that 14, 15, and 16 are perfectly placed where he couldn't have done this on Passover number 1 or Passover number 2. They had to come to an appreciation of who Jesus was. Peter said, "We have come to know that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God." You know, some of them, they probably thought that, but I think he came to appreciate that. And we're going to see Peter's prediction here for his own life as we get to it today. And so I was doing some studying, and I thought, did Judas take the Lord's Supper? Did he take, I shouldn't say Lord's Supper, did Judas take the Passover with the 12? And I think that he did. I referenced all the other Gospels, and it's verses like this. Verse 2, it says, "And supper being ended." What supper? Well, I believe it's the Passover. Remember, this says when Jesus, now it says before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew. Verse 2, "And supper being ended." And not only that, but let's go over to Luke, chapter 22. Remember, Judas was trying to fly under the radar. He had an agenda that involved going to the high priest and saying, "Look, I'm in his inner circle. I can turn him over. I can tell you where he's going to be. What will you give me if I do that?" And they counted out to him 30 pieces of silver. So now he's got that in the back of his mind. Now he's just looking for an opportunity to do it. That's all that's stopping him. He wants to do it. He's agreed to do it. Now he's just looking for an opportunity. I think that if he skips out on this Passover, which every Jew has taken their entire lives, it's going to arouse suspicion. So Luke 22, verse 14, says, "When the hour had come, he sat down, and the 12 apostles with him. He says, Then he said to them, With fervent desire I desire to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I say to you, I will no longer eat of it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God." And of course he goes into the giving of those things. And so then he says, verse 23, verse 22, "And truly the Son of Man goes to them," he basically says he's going to be betrayed. Verse 21, "But behold, the hand of my betrayer is with me on the table." Can you imagine that? I mean, here you're enjoying this beautiful Last Supper. They didn't know it would be their last, or they didn't believe it at that time. But they are enjoying this. I mean, how beautiful are our Lord's Supper services? They're beautiful. Love them. Now, can you imagine if somebody was a spy at one of our suppers? wouldn't that just throw a whole wet blanket on the whole thing? It would upset me, it would upset everybody. And what if we were guaranteed in that room of our Lord's Supper that somebody was a spy? We'd start, is it me? Who is it? Right, you would wonder. And that would upset me, and that would upset you, and hopefully it wouldn't be us. But it's gotta be somebody, right? And Jesus said, somebody with me right now, after they took that supper, is going to betray me. And who was it? Well, we know it was Judas Iscariot. Verse 21, but behold, the hand of my betrayer is with me on the table. I think Judas took this. And I think afterward, and there's another reference in Mark that we won't get to, but this is when we'll read this in John, is when he dipped the bread in the juice and the wine, and he gave it to Judas Iscariot, and said, whatever you're going to do, go do it quickly. And so, it would have aroused more suspicion for the 11 if Judas would have skipped out. With that said, though, Judas leaves. And now you have chapters 14, 15, 16, just for the 11 who really wanted to hear that. I think Jesus was done wasting time. And not only that, but things had to unfold in their time. Judas had to go out there, just get the soldiers, come back, knew Jesus was going to be at the garden that night. And he knew he had that inside knowledge. And so he had to do what he was going to do while Jesus was teaching the 11.
And they were asking, is it me and all this kind of stuff? And he said, to whom I give I'll dip the sop, and I'll hand it to him. It is. Well, they didn't understand what was going on, but the sop or the bread in sauce, he handed it to him. So yeah, you're right. He was there for that.
Yeah.
As a Jew, he wouldn't have missed it.
No, that would have been like, what?
Yeah.
Yeah. But and what I like about this is that he dismissed him and he went to go do his thing before he got that intense training in 14, 15,
Right.
16.
Right.
I mean that is such a beautiful picture. So yeah, he was there for that, as one last stab in the back, having a different agenda, having your mind elsewhere while you're taking that supper. I mean, that's just rotten. That's rotten. If you're going to be there eating and drinking with Jesus and sitting there at the Last Supper, wouldn't you want to be a part of that? Wouldn't you want that? But he's got his mind on how am I going to betray him, and I'm just getting through this meal to get to my 30 pieces of silver.
I've heard, and I don't believe this, but I've heard a lot from the pulpit through the years, not this one, of course, that they didn't think Judas was saved because of the betrayal. And I think that's a teaching throughout. A lot of times they see scriptures as lost and saved, where we see it as faithful and unfaithful, and it's not even referring to the unsaved. But I think if Judas had been unsaved at that point, that he wouldn't have taken his own life after, because he just
Regret.
he felt big regret.
Yeah.
But I believe that just really shows how backslidden we can get.
Satan filled his heart, yeah. But that's one of those age-old, just like even the topic you're on, was Judas present at the Lord's Supper? Okay, age-old debate among Baptists, okay, some say he was, some say he wasn't. I think we're in agreement, you and me anyway, that he wasn't at the Lord's Supper, he was dismissed, okay? At the Passover, certainly. But then another question is, was Judas saved or was he not? I've always took the position that he was unsaved, but in talking with Brother Dave Barnum, he says, I think he was saved, and so he's kind of got me thinking this. Maybe Judas was saved. He was given power with the other apostles to cast out demons and things like this. So, yeah, he could have been just severely speaking. Satan entered his heart, right? And so, I mean, even saved people, Satan can enter their hearts, and fully take over.
Sure.
So I'm not so hardcore that Judas was an unsaved person anymore, like I, was. I don't know about. Do we have any feedback on that? I don't want to get your class off on the wrong.
No, it's fine.
on a
It's
different-
all part of it because we're dealing with it. But I tend to think that he was looking for the Messiah along with everybody else.
Mhm.
I think he was a typical Jewish man that was. So I have no problem if he's saved at all.
Right,
I don't
yeah.
think that like you said, people that are saved can definitely be influenced
Mhm.
by the devil, even to the point that he did. You have something?
Just, yeah, I had heard it once said that it's suspected that his betrayal was driven by the Jewish, I guess, attempts at forcing Jesus' hand to establish the kingdom right then, you know, because we see he didn't hang himself until after Jesus was convicted by the Sanhedrin. You know, of course, I don't know enough, or I haven't studied enough about it to say either way, but it kind of, I guess it makes sense in my mind, you know, because we see the Pharisees, or the Jews were trying to get Jesus to get them out from under the yoke of Rome, and, you know, and so, I'm just gonna babble if you let me go on.
Okay. So, bottom line,
It was, driven by their desire to get Jesus to establish his kingdom right then. But
I think Judas definitely was that. That's what I think Judas's entire motivation was to hook up with somebody that looked like a radical, that everybody was talking about, that had power, that looked like, hey, this one might be the one to overthrow Rome and we can get the kingdom in here and all that. I think he was looking for the kingdom like they all were. And some of the other rebels that had come along, that were trying to do this by force, or, you know, and we've said before is that one of the biggest things that the rebels used was not paying taxes to Rome as their platform. Hey, we don't have to pay taxes to Rome. Who wants to pay taxes? No one really wants to pay taxes, right? But especially to Rome. They didn't want to pay taxes. And so what I think is that, you know, and that's why they tried to trick him and Jesus and say, well, who should we pay taxes to Caesar? And he came up with a beautiful answer and just silenced him. Well, because that was a lot of these other people that had come before him, that was their platform. It's not, we don't have to pay money to those guys. Who are they? We just have to pay it to God. Jesus said, wait a minute, you're living under Rome's rule. I made sure that you're living under Rome's rule. You have to pay taxes to Rome. You have to pay taxes to God, as it were. You know, give to God what he deserves and give to Rome what they deserve. So I have no problem with Judas at all being, you know, looking for that kingdom, but his angle was wrong. He should not have done what he did. And when he realized that Jesus was peaceful and not a revolutionary, he had a problem with that. What can I do to betray this guy and get some money out of the deal, you know? So I don't waste my last 3 years of my life. Pretty rotten, but look what ended up happening. That's what he did.
Is there scripture, you know, when Jesus was calling, you know, all the, like Matthew and everybody, is there scripture when Judas came on board?
No,
There
and I
wasn't?
was just thinking that, and I've never seen it. We have, you know, Andrew, James, or Andrew, Nathaniel, Philip, of course, Peter. There in early chapter John. I think some of the more, I can't think of any ones in the early on. But we see, you know, Nathaniel saying, you know, this is the Lord. After he sees him under the fig tree, we have Peter coming to him because, you know, his brother Andrew told him, and Philip had told him, and so we see early on. But we don't see Judas Iscariot. We don't see Judas Iscariot.
They say that he's the only one from Judea, of course, that's closest to Jerusalem,
Yeah.
and that whole mindset of the, you know, that they would want the kingdom versus Galilee,
Yeah.
you know.
Matthew's another one. Matthew was sitting at the tax office and he calls him. But we don't really have a picture of what Judas Iscariot was doing before. We don't know what he did, and I'm sure we can look in history, but the Bible doesn't tell us that he was a tax collector, a fisherman, or whatever. We don't know what he did. We know what he ended up doing. And by the way, I don't know if we're not going to get to it in John, but maybe at the very end of John we'll talk about this. But let me ask you this: how did Judas Iscariot die?
How did he die?
How did he die?
He hung himself.
Hung himself. That's one account. What's the other account?
Oh.
What does Acts say? Rushing headlong into a field,
Oh, because the rope broke.
right? Exactly.
Yeah.
So people look at that and say, oh, the Bible has two different accounts of how Judas Iscariot died, right? Because it talks about how his stomach burst open and his innards spilled out, pretty gruesome, right? But the Bible doesn't contradict itself. So what happened was he hung himself. And then he was sitting there, it's gross, but he was sitting there rotting in the sun. And his body became full of gases. And at some point, the rope got cut, or the rope, he just fell. Maybe because his neck got loose. I don't know what happened, it's gross. But at that point, he hit the ground and his stomach burst open. Thus the two different seemingly accounts. But the point is, he had ended his life hanging himself. And that he fell from the tree, and his obviously there was a reaction inside his body where the gases made the membrane of his stomach very thin, and it burst open. And so you're like, well, that doesn't look right, but that's exactly how you can correlate those two events. It's just that I could say so-and-so got stabbed, but then you say so-and-so bled to death. Well, you're looking at the end of it, but I'm looking at the beginning of it, and together we can put together the two different things that happen. And so, it just food for thought in case we ever get there. But 13 isn't really known. It's not famous, if you will, for the verses I've read so far. It's famous for this next part. And supper being ended, the devil having already put it into the heart of Judas, verse 2, of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God, and that he was going to God, rose from supper, and laid aside his garments, his outer garments, so like his jacket, if you will. Why do we roll up our sleeves sometimes? Well, if we're going to wash dishes, or we're going to wash the dog or something, you roll up your sleeves. You get down and dirty with it, okay? Jesus is about to do a very, very, I should say unclean thing. When you wash somebody's feet, that's a very dirty part of their body because of the way they wore sandals and dirt and all that. They didn't have paved roads and Mercedes, okay? They had BMWs. So they had to walk everywhere. Feet were very dirty. And it's not just that feet were dirty, it's just that what he's going to do is it's a symbol. He's symbolizing something. And so here he took off his outer garment, puts it aside, took a towel and girded himself. Why? Well, why do people wear aprons? Right? Dry your hands off real quick, What's he going to do? He's going to take a basin of water, he's going to wash his disciples' feet, and he's going to dry them with the towel that's girded around his waist. And he's going to move from person to person to person to person. And after that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded. Then he came to Simon Peter, and Peter said to him, Lord, are you washing my feet? And we've talked about this before in church. How Jesus was going from disciple to disciple to disciple, and this is lighting up he's lighting him up. He's getting mad. I would use the word indignant.
Yeah, he's very indignant.
How dare Jesus lower himself, knowing who he is? How dare he lower himself to wash everyone's feet? He's thinking, not when you get to me. I'm putting a stop to this. Because I know who you are. And you're not going to wash my feet. Is that what he says?
King would have servants to do that. I think
Absolutely.
He's performing the task
Absolutely.
of a servant.
I think he's embarrassed on behalf of Jesus that he's doing this. That's what I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because if we put ourselves in his shoes, as it were, that's how we might feel.
Out of respect.
Out of
He's
respect.
respecting him so
Absolutely.
much.
That's where it comes from, is respect.
I mean, think about it. If Ronald Reagan, I pick Ronald Reagan. I have to go that far back. But anyway, Ronald Reagan were to walk in here and begin to wash our feet, how would you take that? Okay, so you're the 10th guy in line, so you're not the first guy, you're still in shock, but you're watching him, like you said, move from person, and you know he's coming to you, and you know you're not worthy of the President of the United States washing your feet, you know? So like you said, this is building up in him.
Well, I'd look at it like, you mentioned Reagan. What if he had a big old shindig for Mikhail Gorbachev, right? He's sitting there waiting in the big old ballroom in the White House, and there's Reagan just vacuuming, right? I mean, that's what it'd be like. He looks at him like, you know, what are you doing? Don't you have people to do that for you? But that, you know, and then he puts that away, then he comes over and shakes his hand. You'd think, what is up with that, right? Why would you lower yourself? You have all these servants to do something like that for you. Servants, employees, whatever you might call them. But why would that whole, it's funny to us because we never see that.
Right.
But I'm telling you, as funny as that is, this is 10 million times more, or weirder, I guess you could say. Unless Jesus is making a point. And Jesus is making a point. So he says, and I said indignant. Peter's getting indignant watching Jesus do this. And I think the other apostles are just as surprised as Peter is. I really do. It's just that Peter, as we studied, has the loudest mouth. Okay? Verse 6. Then he came to Simon Peter, and Peter said to him, Lord, are you washing my feet? Well, Jesus answered and said to him, what I am doing you do not understand now, but you will know after this. Peter has not a good enough answer for him. Because he said, Peter said to him, you shall never, never wash my feet. I'm never going to allow you to debase yourself to wash my feet. Jesus answered him, if I do not wash you, you have no part with me. Oh boy, 180. Throw it in reverse, take back comment, go the other way. Well, that's what it means. Peter said to him, you shall never do that. Verse 9, Peter said to him, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. Just go for it all. If I'm not going to have any part with you and you're washing my feet, just wash my whole body now. All the way from my head, all the way down to my feet. Just take care of me. Because I want that part with you. We've talked about part before in the Greek and all that. That's a good word study. But he's talking about his inheritance. And Peter knows he's talking about his inheritance. He's saying, Peter, you don't have a future with me now or in the kingdom if I don't do this for you right now. Well, that got his attention. That got his attention. Jesus said to him, he who is bathed needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean. And you are all clean, and you are clean, but not all of you. For he knew who would betray him. Therefore he said, you are not all clean. So at this point, Judas Iscariot, guess what? He's still there. He's still there in the room. He hasn't been dismissed yet. He ate the supper with them. Jesus washed his feet. Why do I say that? Because he leaves in just a couple verses. He's still there. So when he had washed their feet, taken his garment, so he washed their, he's done washing their feet, put his jacket back on, as it were, and sat down again, he said to them, do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you say well, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, see, those are positions that we have with Christ. He's our Lord, he's our teacher. But he's saying, if I've done that to you, that takes away any prejudice you could have against each other. Any big eyes and little U's, I've just erased it for you. And so he says, if I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. That doesn't mean literal. That's an attitude. That you're not better than me and I'm not better than you. There's no big eyes, there's no little U's in the ecclesia of God. Jesus knew that if this was going to work through the ages, like we're studying on Wednesday nights, that it could turn into a papacy and have a whole bunch of power at the top, and the little U's learning what just a little trickle of crumbs that the big eyes want to give them. When the little U's are supposed to be preparing for the kingdom as much as the big eyes are. Jesus didn't set up his church like that.
I was just going to say, I think, I'm not sure, I don't know specifically, but I would imagine that some have misconstrued this and basically want to wipe out the idea of leadership And he's not wiping out leadership at all. I mean, they were clearly his ordained apostles, that they held that position. But it was among the leadership that it could go south in their hearts. So he wasn't dismissing, he wasn't equalizing, making everybody the same.
Yeah.
Just saying among you, these leaders, because we see even as late as the book of Revelation, they're still singled out as the 12.
Yeah.
Okay? That among them, and Paul warned this too, that among the elders it would arise some deceiving. Okay, so he wasn't dismissing the idea of leadership among the body. They would take care that they would not
Right.
go to seed on it.
Right. Or let it go to their heads. We're
Yeah.
gonna take a quick look at a verse, but we have to couple this, like you said, with the teachings of the rest of the New Testament that talk about order in the church and the various offices and stuff like that. So it's not that he didn't leave them leaderless, it's that everything has its place. And in order for the leadership to not, like you said, get too big of a head, he says, look, as your ultimate leader, as the Son of God, he's washing your feet. You now are to do that. You can teach that in the assemblies that you might be pastor over, or to teach other men that they're going to be pastor over. And so, let's go to Matthew for a clearer picture of where I think all this fits. Matthew 20. We referenced this the other day. Then the mother, verse 20 of 20, then the mother of Zebedee's sons, who's that? James and John, right? So James and John, part of the 12 apostles. Then the mother of Zebedee's sons came to him with her sons, kneeling down and asking something from him. And he said to her, what do you wish? She said to him, grant that these 2 sons of mine may sit, one on your right hand and the other on your left, in your kingdom. What was that all? You want to talk about the ultimate request probably in the Bible. I really am searching my brain for something that's higher than that, and I really can't. He's not asking for the throne, that's Jesus. She asked to the left and right of that.
Pretty bold.
Wow. Yeah. It doesn't get much higher than that.
Which is interesting, because if she had more than 2 kids.
Yeah.
Whoops.
To the left of
Just
him.
those 2. What if
To
she
the
had
right
6
of the
sons?
right,
Yeah.
left of the left.
Yeah.
But Jesus answered and said, you do not know what you ask. Are you able to drink? And I think he's specifically talking, I think they're all kneeling, by the way, or maybe just her. But I think that they're right next to her, the 2 sons, and I think he's addressing them now. You do not know what you ask. Are you able to drink the cup that I am able to drink? And be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with? What's he saying? Are you able to go through the same hardship, the same death, the same life that I'm going to go through, the same persecutions? Are you able to do that? Because that's what it's going to take to be on my right hand and my left hand in the kingdom. That's what it's going to take to even be in the kingdom. Let alone on his left hand and his right hand. Are you able to do that? Because you're asking for something that's way up here. Now you have to give something that's way up there in order to get that. He says, you want all, are you willing to give all? And they said to him, we are able. I think Jesus here in verse 23 predicts the future. Because they don't know. Peter said, I was able. Did he keep that promise?
Right.
Not right away. So he said to them, you will indeed drink my cup and be baptized with the baptism that I'm baptized with. You will go through with the death for me. You will live this life, and at the end, you will make it to the kingdom. I think that's essentially what he's saying. But to sit on my right hand, and this other blessing that you're asking about, to sit on my right hand and on my left hand is not mine to give, but it is for those for whom it is prepared by my Father. She at least knew, the mother of the sons, at least knew enough to know that somebody was going to sit there. It's amazing, isn't it? Who's going to sit there? Jesus didn't tell him that day. We may never know. I should say never know. We don't know now. We'll know then. We don't know. We don't know now. And when the 10 heard it, remember the 10 are listening to this, the other 10 apostles are listening to this. Who do you think you are asking this privilege in the kingdom of God when we're all in the same boat, literally sometimes and figuratively.
And to have your mother do it. I
Right.
mean,
Yeah,
come on,
but now
you're
that
having
we
your
got my
mother
mother
doing
into
this.
it.
Coward.
Come on. You don't even have the guts to ask.
Yeah.
You're
Right,
having your
right.
mom ask you.
Exactly.
Right, right.
I'd be
Come
back
on,
by
John.
6, you know,
Yeah.
one of those deals, right? Junior high, you get dropped off. No, and you're right, she's doing this on behalf, and remember, wasn't it Bathsheba that asked something for David on behalf of Solomon? So we see that sometimes moms get involved and they, ask things for their kids. This was a very large thing to ask for your kids, okay?
And in front of everybody.
And it wasn't
Yeah.
private, it was in front of everybody. The 10 heard it, they were greatly displeased with the 2 brothers.
Yeah.
Jesus said, all right, time for a team meeting. Now, bring it in, okay? Teaching opportunity alert, right here. Because he knew, guess what? There's gonna be some sort of schism if he doesn't deal with this right now. But Jesus called them to himself and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. The rulers, he's talking about the rulers versus them. 2 different groups of people, right? And that those who exercise authority and those who are great, so the lording over them, exercise authority over the ones that aren't great. That's just how they have it set up. That's how the Romans have it set up. That's how the Greeks had it set up. That's how Joe Blow Philistine has it set up. That's how the world works. You have your big eyes and your little U's. Yet it shall not be so among you. And he's talking to all 12 of them. But whoever desires to become great among you, let him be your servant. And whoever desires to be first among you, let him be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. Does he say a servant is not above his master? If Jesus came to serve, should we expect to be served in this life? No. Jesus set the example here. And he can preach this all day long, but it's when he demonstrated it in John chapter 13 that he put feet on his words. And he made this lesson time a reality when he's the one that took off his outer garment, put on the towel, went through each disciple with a basin of water and washed the dirtiest part of their body. He demonstrated these words. It says, there isn't going to be big eyes and little U's among you. You're my leadership, but don't let that go to your head. Don't let all these things. And what does Paul say? Paul said, in spite of the many revelations, visions, personal teaching by Jesus, he says, I could have gotten a big head. He said, but God kept something as a thorn in my side to keep me humble, lest he goes off the deep end and starts saying, look at me. So we have that thorn in our side, as it were. We need to remember to be humble. We need to remember to serve each other, because that's the way the church is set up. You have something to go?
Just complete opposite of what the example that they had for years from the Pharisees. Complete opposite.
That's kind of it. Yeah, you couldn't get more opposite. Because you had them praying long prayers in the marketplaces. You had them, ringing a bell before they put their offering in, at the temple. Drawing attention to themselves and wearing these garments that would just scream, wow, that person's religious. I used to work with a guy that went to Italy for a trip just by himself or maybe with a group, but he said, and he wasn't any way, shape, or form had a faith that I knew of. But he said he went into one of the really old, in Italy, one of the really, really, really old church buildings, Catholic of course, but it's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years old. And he said you walked in there and you could just feel God. I think what he's saying is you walk in there and you can feel the old architecture, you can see the stained glass windows.
Right.
You probably see priests walking around wearing robes with tassels and all that, and that's religion to him. He felt God there. That's the appearance that they want to show you. Of course they're going to come off like that.
you listen closely, you could probably still hear the screams of our forefathers in the back.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Yeah.
No kidding. So back in 13, we'll try to wrap up some of these thoughts here. We get over, but let's just get through verse 30. So he says, verse 14, it says, "If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should do as I have done to you. Most assuredly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is he who is sent greater than he who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them." Don't just know them, don't just, oh yeah, I know. No, actually do them. Actually put that mentality into practice that, you know, there's no big I's and little U's. We have our teachers that we're supposed to respect, we have our pastor that we're supposed to respect, we have our, members that we are supposed to respect. There's no disharmony in any of that. So Jesus said, I've given you an example, I've washed your feet. You guys don't get big heads about this. Keep it humble. And so I believe that's what they did. Verse 18. He says, "I do not speak concerning all of you, I know whom I have chosen. But that the scripture may be fulfilled, he who eats bread with me has lifted up his heel against me." I think that was a psalm. And David was very, very distraught. The fact that it wasn't somebody that was an enemy of his that had betrayed him, it was one of his own that he had eaten bread with. Like Noah's talked about deception. You don't expect deception to come from somebody like that. You expect it to come from the outside, and you're already guarded there. But when you let your guard down and you let other people in, and then they're the ones who deceive you. You take that harder, right? Jesus said, it's somebody that I'm going to be eating bread with that has deceived me, or that has lifted up his heel against me. Now I tell you before it comes that when it does come to pass, you may believe that I am he. Most assuredly I say to you, he who receives whomever I send receives me, and whoever receives me receives him who sent me. It's just this pattern of that he's always preached. If you believe me, you believe the Father. If you're looking for the Father, he's pointing to me. Just this pattern. And when Jesus had said these things, he was troubled in spirit. Remember, he's already been troubled. This is the second time he said that he's troubled. Well, what other time was he troubled in spirit? Just before he raised Lazarus. Remember that? He was troubled in spirit. When Jesus had said these things, he was troubled in spirit and testified and said, most assuredly I say to you, he's just going to come out and say it now, one of you will betray me. Remember, they had just eaten supper, the Lord's Supper, the Last Supper, the feast. Now they're going to, about ready to have this beautiful sermon opened up to him. And this is the bombshell that he unleashes just before he does that. One of you is going to betray me. Boy, that, like I said, in our beautiful settings of Lord's Supper services, to hear those words and to know that it's true, one of the person is going to be a spy or something. Somebody's not there for the right reasons. And the disciples looked at one another, perplexed about who he spoke. Now there was leaning on Jesus' bosom, so I picture them laying down at this time. But the Jews have a whole different culture than we do. We had chairs and tables and all that. But after supper, they would lean back. It's a whole different. I guess it's a whole different. We've seen movies or pictures of what this looks like. Now there was one leaning on Jesus' bosom, one of his disciples whom Jesus loved. That's how John, the Apostle John, refers to himself as. Which means he's part of his inner circle. He loved all the disciples, of course, but there was three of them that were a little bit closer to Jesus: Peter, James, and John. We see Peter, James, and John in Acts focused on. Not so much the others, Thomas, you kind of lose track of, but Peter, James, and John. So this is John he's talking about. Simon Peter therefore motioned to him to ask him, or to ask who it was of whom he spoke. And so I can picture this Peter once again. No surprise. I think he's sitting probably across the table from him. Now he just gives a little motion. He didn't talk. He just ask him. Little head, maybe a little head nod or something. Find out who it is. Then leaning back on Jesus' breast, so now they're in a reclined position, you know, their feet probably tucked in and they're kind of leaning back. Leaning back on Jesus' breast, he said to him, Lord, who is it? And I think he probably whispered it. I don't think this was all out there. Jesus answered, it is he to whom I shall give a piece of bread when I have dipped it. And having dipped the bread, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon. Now after the piece of bread, Satan entered. Now his fate is just sealed. Yeah, he'd done all those other things on his own, you know, but now it's what he's going to do, he's just going to get it done. And there's not going to be any going back. So he says, and then Jesus said to him, what you do quickly. Just don't stall. Don't wait for another opportunity. Go out there and get it done. Go get your troops, come back, and I'll be in the garden waiting for you. Let's not drag this out anymore. But no one at the table knew for what reason he had said this to him. For some thought because Judas had the money box that Jesus had said to him, buy those things we need for the feast. Remember, because the feast is going on for another 7 days, right? Or that he should give something to the poor. Having received the piece of bread, he then went out immediately. It was night. Not there for the beautiful sermon in 14, 15, and 16. Not a part of it. Doesn't want to be a part of it. He bailed. He's got another agenda going on. So, next week we'll finish up 13. We'll look a little bit about Peter's life and confidence that he thought he had. Anybody have anything else?
Good stuff. You handled it well, even with our little side trips.
I like side trips. I like it. All right, let's go ahead and